Hi, I'm Tilo. Today, what you're going to hear are some excerpts from a talk we gave to a local youth group. One of the young men had come with a couple of challenges that he had encountered. And these were very common along the lines of if God is loving and merciful, then why do we see these apparent acts of anger and wrath in the Old Testament? And what about hell and eternal suffering? And if these things are so, how do we reconcile them? And really, there's more of a challenge at the basis of this than a question. And really, the idea says if God is loving and merciful, then he can't do these things. And if he does these things, then that's proof that he can't be loving and merciful. And so, in order to answer a challenge like that, all you have to show is that there's a possibility of understanding the things you see with a motivation of mercy and benevolence. And then, if there is a scenario you can imagine where this can be so, then the objection is not necessarily so, and so it's therefore been answered. So, in doing this, at the beginning of this talk, we had very bad audio, so you won't hear any of that. But we looked at, to begin with, some questions like what is punishment? We have an idea very often that punishment is inflicting suffering as retribution, and that is only one possibility of the meaning of the word. Punishment itself is really imposing anything on somebody that they would rather not want in response to some wrong they've done. And excuse me. And this can run a pretty wide spectrum. It can be something like punishing your child with the entire intent of training them so they have a better life and don't harm themselves and others. And so you put them through some unpleasantness for a short period with the hope that long term they will have a much better life. Another possibility is something like incarceration, where you would place somebody in a constrained environment and your sole motivation is to protect the innocent. You're not looking to hurt the person. That isn't what you wanted to do, but it's something that's necessary in order to protect the truly innocent. And so there again, you're motivated by benevolence toward future victims. Another possibility for punishment is the retribution, the causing somebody to suffer. Another possibility is to protect you from yourself, from harming yourself in a way that makes you in a worse and worse state. For instance, St. Athanasius talks about this degradation of humanity, that humanity started off in the image of God and then through the fall continued to do acts out of this fallen nature that continued to worsen the state of being. And there's sort of a symbiotic relationship going on where the worse the acts are, the worse it makes the state of being, and the worse state of being causes worse acts, and then this downward spiral. So, for instance, if you halted somebody from doing that, from acting out on their sinful desires, you would stop half of this degrading process. You couldn't stop them from wanting to sin and wanting to do that which is evil, because you would have to destroy the human free will. And if you did that, you would essentially destroy what it is to be human. And out of, again, benevolence, God would not destroy our humanity. So these are just possibilities. These are not dogma, these are not doctrine. They are just possible ways of understanding what we see as something that could be benevolent. The more common understandings you would see in Orthodoxy tend to be that it's the presence of God to those who hate him that will be the source of torment. And another that you tend to hear is the turning away from God into darkness is the source of torment. And I don't think those two are necessarily exclusive of one another. So again, this is not dogma and this is not doctrine, but I do believe that some of these ideas do fall within the scope of dogma and doctrine and clearly draw on possibilities, such as at the end of the book of Revelation, you do see something of a constraint and a confinement happening where it speaks of Satan and the demons being chained up. I think we would have a general understanding that hell is not the sinner's playground where Satan is the president, but rather it's something where it is unpleasant and more unpleasant for the more evil. And so the idea of constraint, not being able to act out on one's sin, I think we would all agree that for the sinner, this is tormenting, not to be able to act out those sinful desires. And I think we would agree that such will be the case, that there will not be an allowance to go on inflicting oneself upon those around them and upon themselves and harming themselves further. So while these aren't dogma or doctrine, they do draw upon some ideas that seem to be fairly mainstream in Christian thought. So these are just a movement into exploring some of these ideas as possibilities that could harmonize the picture of the language of suffering and torment that we see with a completely benevolent intent. And we move into the idea of justice and what is that. And really, it's just setting things the way they ought to be. It really doesn't mean anything more than that. And the question is, what is it that is done to set things as they ought to be? That's the whole question of justice. Anyway, so with that in mind, I hope you'll find some things here of some benefit. Enjoy. So when we talk about justice, we have to stop and go, okay, wait a minute. Justice is to set things as they ought to be. It's that simple, to set things as they ought to be. When you're working on a Word document, there's a thing you can click on to justify the document. What does that do when you click on that? No. What it does, it lines up the edges of the document. And it evens up the sides and lines it all up. That's justifying a Word document. It's setting it as it ought to be. Now the question is, what is required to make things as they ought to be? See, I think one of the other problems that we have, because of the Western Protestant understanding, is we presume justice means retribution. Right. It means payback. That is not what that word means at all. Now, some people have the idea that payback is what makes things right. And Jesus dealt with that, didn't he? The people who said payback will make things right. He said, no, we don't do that. You turn to them the other cheek. That's how you'll make it right. You give to them your tunic also. That's how you'll make it right. You take the offense and you forgive it. And that's what makes it right. That's what makes it go away, is you forgiving the offense, not you striking out in retribution and vengeance to pay them back. So we need to ask, what is this concept of justice? Now, when we say God's justice demands somebody be punished, then the next question I have is justice an ethereal reality above God, or is it an attribute of God? So, an attribute of God. So, is it this kind of cosmic reality that's bigger than God, that God has to comply with? I'm sorry, but justice requires it. Or is it something within God? So if it's something within God, then when we say to satisfy justice, we're saying to make things right as they ought to be within God, as he understands it, to make it right. So are we saying that inflicting suffering and torture on somebody is what makes things right inside of God? Of course not. Of course not. This is not the picture that Christ came and gave us of God. that inflicting suffering on people is what makes things right in him. But you can't just use this word justice as though it's some external reality. It has to be something within him. And somebody who is made right inside by inflicting suffering and torture on people is called a sadist. It has a very real word, and it's a very sick mental condition that we see. It comes from the Marquis de Sade, who was the most famous one, who got pleasure inflicting torture on people. So we need to understand what justice means and what it can't mean in order to examine this question of what is hell and what is the word punishment when we see it. And since we have a broad number of possibilities for punishment, we need to ask ourselves, is inflicting torture as retribution on somebody for wronging them, is this justice? Is this what God does? Is this satisfying God? Is this the expression of an attribute of God? And what about God's love and mercy? You see, there's another concept called divine simplicity, which means God is not composed of pieces. What he is fully and completely all the time. He's not pieces of things. So when there's a question, do I show mercy or justice? If he is only expressing one of those attributes and has to constrain the expression of another attribute, this is God at war against God within God. And this is not our understanding of God. What God is expressed fully and completely at all times. So when we look at something, now we'll backtrack, like to the Old Testament, and we see God doing something that looks really brutal. You know, they did this thing wrong, and God killed these people. Well, that really has a picture of somebody who's very angry and striking out in anger in retribution to make somebody pay. But this is anthropomorphic language. This is how it looks from their point of view. But in reality, if we look at God the way we understand him as Orthodox, as all-loving and always fully expressing his love, then let's go back and look at that same picture again. Mankind is going to live forever. And our life on this earth is that long in the bigger picture of things, of forever. And God is working throughout the Old Testament to bring about the plan of salvation, to keep a people unto himself through whom he will bring the Savior of all mankind. And he's dealing with all of humanity as a single organism to preserve and grow and move humanity along to prepare them for this salvation. This is what God's doing throughout the Old Testament over this period of time. So much like if you're an organism and you have a small cancerous area, and I cut that out, is that based on my love and care for you or my anger towards you? So I often give this analogy. The Marquis de Sade was somebody who really tortured people and got pleasure in it. And I would say a man is standing over a table and he's cutting off a woman's breast. Is that good or evil? Exactly. So give an example. Then he's benevolent. And if this person is a sadist, then it's evil. Exactly. So here, I don't want to just look at the thing being done. I want to understand what the reason is. And the way we understand salvation history, with God preserving humanity, working with humanity as an organism, we understand that these temporary movements and removing people to save the larger organism is benevolent, and it goes beyond that. We read that when Christ descended into Hades, he preached. Right? Now, what did he preach? Did he preach, ha ha, I told you so? Or did he preach the same thing he preached everywhere, which was the good news? And it says when he ascended, he led captives in his train. So I believe, and this isn't dogma, this is my belief based on what I have read, it is completely reasonable to think that all the people who died before had an opportunity to receive grace and to receive Christ.
God does everything for the greater benefit. Then how come we're not like the Catholics believe in like purgatory and death? And how come God still doesn't have such a
Okay, I was going to get to that next. The Catholics have the concept of purgatory. The Eastern Orthodox have this concept of toll houses, which is similar. These things after death that you have to go through to get to heaven. And we have the concept that we pray for the dead. For 40 days. So what is the same in all three of those is there's some sort of unfinished business. It's not like, death is the buzzer and that's it. I believe with these three put together, and again, this is not dogma, okay? This is not dogma. But I believe there's sufficient evidence between all three of us agreeing that there's some kind of unfinished business after death, that there is some opportunity for repentance. We don't know. But I think there are indicators to make it not unreasonable to think that there is. And then I can add to that the attributes of God. That this whole thing would be like a cosmic game show, and you got the wrong answer, so now you're going to spend eternity cut off from God makes no sense to me based on the God that I understand. Because the God that I understand and the God that I've been taught and experienced and learned about is one who is completely benevolent, is one to whom I do not believe one person will be in hell that would rather be with God. I honestly believe that, based on who God is and the power of God. So I believe that opens a door for a possibility, again, this isn't dogma, but a possibility of some sort of repentance after death. And this also kind of gives me a picture that the people who are in hell don't want to be with God. And I think we have a great deal of evidence to support that as well. I think it's very clear that many people knowingly do reject his righteousness and his goodness. And now we need to ask then, what is it? What is hell? Well, since we can't define it, we can ask a couple of things of what it can't be. So I don't believe, based upon all of these things, that it's retribution, that the point is to make you suffer. But then we look at the term punishment, and with our broader understanding of it, what if, I'll give you an example. Saint Athanasius, he spoke of man in sort of a downward spiral, and of a symbiotic relationship between our sins and state of being. Symbiosis is two things that basically feed back and forth into one another. And so he spoke of this sort of descent of man into degrading himself. And he said if this went on forever, man would become as nothing, and if it went on long enough, man would become like an animal. So on his way from being how he was created to be like God, he's descending and degrading himself, and he said eventually he'd be like an animal. We see people who are very close to animals. We see that. If you saw the shootings that just happened, there was that one woman laying on the sidewalk that was still alive screaming for help, and he walked up and put 2 rounds into her as she was crying. That's very near moving into an animal state. Many things happen where people are moving very close to being like animals. And then St. Athanasius said, because we came from nothing, our nature is to be nothing. That we only sustained in our nature to be something more than nothing by God. But if we keep rejecting and pushing God out, we keep moving downward and downward toward the nothing. This is the basic picture of on the incarnation, why Christ came to restore humanity back to the image of God that he was created to be. He saved us. You see, he didn't come to satisfy a God who needed to punish somebody. He came to rescue somebody who was degrading and becoming like an animal and eventually would become nothing. And he was saving that image of himself. But in Athanasius, as he talks about this condescension, our sinful acts worsen our state of being. And that worsened state of being, out of it flows worse sinful acts. And down and down and down it goes into this spiral. Just like in Christ, our righteous acts improve our state of being and become more like God. And becoming more like God, out of us flow more righteous acts. And it's an upward ascension rather than a downward degradation. And so, I would say, when we die, I think we all understand God will not allow us, those who are unrepentant, will not allow them to go on sinning and expressing that sin. Hell isn't the big party, for the sinner, where it's like, yeah, now we can do whatever we want. There's suffering. And that suffering is the lack of ability to express your sinful desires. You can't. Now, I believe when we express our sinful desires, we hurt others. If God is merciful, he will protect the others. If you are able to express your sinful desires in hell, then the people who will be the happiest in hell will be the most evil. And the people who will be the most miserable will be the least evil. Because the most evil will be inflicting themselves upon the least evil. This does not fit any picture we have of justice or what is right, or of hell, or of Jesus saying it will be worse on that day for these than these. It will not be worse for the better people and better for the worse people. This does not match any picture we've been given. But instead, if there are more evil people that are constrained and not able to inflict themselves on less evil people, that will be a greater suffering for the more evil people, not being able to express that. So if theoretically this were merciful to protect the less evil people, then this would fit as God expressing his benevolence in as much as he can express it. Because there is a constraint on how much benevolence God can express, and that's the human will. If we will not allow him to fully express his benevolence towards us, then he will express as much as he can. And to protect the less evil from the more, that is an expression of benevolence. Another one is, as we look at Athanasius and this condescension, this symbiotic relationship, if he stops us from sinning, we stop degrading our own state of being. We stop the degradation process, which if it went on forever, our state of being would continuously get worse and worse. He can't, again, stop us to will to sin, but he can stop us acting on it. And that's half of that symbiotic relationship. There's the will and the action. And then the man acts, and that act makes his state of being worse. Now he wills for something worse, and then he does something worse. And that makes him worse, and he wills for something worse. If you stop the action, you stop that degradation. You hold it where it is, and you don't let it go further. Again, is this not benevolent? To stop you from harming yourself and going down a road that only hurts you more and more and more. This again would be an expression, theoretically, of benevolence being expressed toward humanity. So these things are not dogma, but they fit all the pieces that we have, and they fit together with the idea of God being all benevolent. You see, one problem we have, and I've seen this especially with Facebook theologians, is people think that theology is simply a matter of cut and paste quotes from patristics. That is not what theology is, not systematic theology. In systematic theology, we may examine certain fathers and come to an understanding of what we believe they're saying. But when we're done with that, that is not the end of theology. That's the beginning of systematic theology. Because now we say, I've come to the conclusion that this is what these fathers are saying. You have to take that conclusion, and it has to fit with everything else in your belief system. This has to fit with your understanding of who God is. If you land with your understandings on a God who has to torture people to feel better, you have a real problem with your theology. Even if you're pretty sure the Father said that, you have a problem because you already said God was all-loving and he loves humanity. Now you're saying he's not allowing himself to express love towards humanity as much as he possibly can? You've created a constraint on God expressing himself. That's a huge theological problem. So you have to put all of the pieces together to fit with the other things you know to form a satisfactory systematic theology.
The best thing I can do.
Yeah. What if the most benevolent thing I can do to you, for you, is something that you don't want? Will you experience that as punishment? Yes. For you, yes. So why does God punish? Because he is benevolent. He imposes on people what they do not want because he is benevolent. Just like a parent, a good parent, will do with a small child. He will impose a timeout that the child does not want, and the child is screaming and miserable because he loves him and to accomplish some other goal, and there is no other way to accomplish that other goal other than doing this. And if there is no other way to accomplish it because of the will of the child, keep in mind the will of the person. If because of the will of the child, the only way that I can express the benevolence toward you is by doing something that you don't want, that you experience as punishment. Why am I punishing you? Because I love you. But that punishment isn't something intended to inflict suffering. The reason it's experienced as suffering is because of you, the child. You're the reason it's being experienced as suffering. And over time you will come to understand it, hopefully. Maybe you don't. And if you don't, you end up in prison. And they're inflicting something on you. And in a compassionate, decent society, the point of prison would not be to make you suffer. The point of prison would be to protect innocent people from you. They're the ones that I'm being compassionate towards. I would be completely compassionate towards you and let you be free. Only you're going to go hurt people again.
Solitary confinement.
See, if I put somebody in a prison cell and I give him computer, nice bed, a couch, set it up like a nice apartment, so he can go out in the yard and, I fence off an area, beauty, and I go out of my way, give you anything I can to make your life as good as it can be, but I can't let you out and among people. But you really want to go harm people. This is punishment. But the entire motivation has nothing to do with making you suffer. It's just to protect the innocent people. If I put you in a little tiny cell with no bed, nothing, no books, nothing, and I come in every day and I burn you with hot irons, that's also punishment. But the intent is to make you suffer. So we need to understand the difference when we use that word. So I have no problem with the word punishment as long as we understand what we mean by it. So the question, why did he create angels if he knew he was going to make man fall, is based upon the presumption that if there were no angels, man wouldn't have fallen. I don't think that's a fair presumption.
Well, angels was one of the reasons that he didn't want.
A reason, but was he the only reason? And would man have fallen if there had been no angel? I believe that ultimately, if constraining Satan would have avoided the fall altogether, that would have been done. But I believe that the fact that he didn't constrain Satan. And at the end of the book, he does. Remember? You read it in Revelation. It says Satan and the demons are chained up. So I think we have this wrong picture that Satan and the demons, like Satan's the president of hell, and this is his big party ground. I don't think he gets a reward at the end of the book. Exactly. Because I don't think the hell is his reward where he gets his own kingdom. Right. I think he's the one punished worse than anybody because he had no tempter. There was nobody to tempt him. So I think we have a wrong picture sometimes about what that means. So since God, we see, does constrain Satan, I think if constraining him would have avoided the fall, he would have done so. I think that man, it's ego. So it's the self that asks, what if? Is something being kept from me? I think if there wasn't a tree, man still would have fallen in some other way. I think the tree was something that simplified it. The tree was something that made it easier for man, not harder. Because there would have been a million ways to sin. And God made it simple, narrowed it to one, and told him. Man didn't just have an impulse and do something that was sinful. And there were a million things. Look around the world today. It says man creates new ways of doing evil, and we do. And we have 10 million ways we can sin. So instead of 10 million ways to sin and not know that it was sin, he gave us one. Just don't do that. Don't touch that one. And I think that was extremely gracious of him. Now you know what it is. You know this is the only thing you can't do. And I'm going to put it right here so you know and it's clear to you. Alexander Schmemann talks about basically that man was created to worship God and to have a relationship with God and to learn of God and to grow in God, eternally to grow in God. And God put his image within man. And God made himself known in everything he made. And man was to discover God in all of creation. If you notice when he comes and he names the animals, God asks him to name them, he's giving them, they have names that actually are attributes. And these are good attributes. So he's seeing God's nature, maybe that's not the best word, but God's attributes he's seeing within these animals as God is showing himself to man in all of this wondrous creation. And so man is to worship God through the creation. And in the creation, he is to worship God and to use creation to worship God and to get to know God. This is communion with God. Just as we take the wheat from, I think it was St. Ignatius talks about the wheat from, all these hilltops and grind them together into one loaf. As this is a picture of the church. And grind them together and make one loaf out of them and partake of it in communion. And take the grapes from all over the vineyards and squeeze them together into one cup. And this is a picture again of communion. So in this way, we are taking creation and worshiping God in and through creation. And then God says, but there's one thing, this one. That is communing with creation itself, not communing with God through creation. Do you see the difference? So in communing with the created thing itself, what is that called? There's a word for that. No, there's a word. It's not a good word for communing with the created thing itself. It's idolatry. That's communing. That's communing with the created thing. That's having an idol instead of communing with God. Okay, so here we have the first sin, which is idolatry. And now here we are again at Lent. What are we doing? We are fasting from a lot of things. These things are areas in which we have been communing with the created. We have been in an unholy communion and in an unholy covenant with the created thing in itself. And the idea and the purpose, if you ever do a really true, complete Lent, is what you're doing is you're getting a divorce. You're divorcing yourself from this world. You're breaking the unholy communion, and you're seeking God entirely and reestablishing the proper communion between us and God. Once that proper communion is established, I don't know if any of you have done like a true full Lent, but this whole world comes alive in a way you've never seen it alive. That you see God and sense God in the trees and in the birds and in, I remember one time on my motorcycle, in the asphalt. In the asphalt, I could sense God's present here in this asphalt as I'm riding my motorcycle. And he's present there on the hill, and he's present there in the sidewalk, and he's present in that person in that car. And he's present in all things. And there comes this awareness, once we get spiritual eyes back, of the presence of God in everything. Now we are worshiping God once again, as we were supposed to in the beginning, in and through all the created things. But first, you have to break the communion with the created things, because they are in the place of God. They are idols. And once the idols are smashed and taken out of the way, and we establish the proper communion with God, he now reestablishes our proper relationship to creation. And now we go back to worshiping him in and through creation. This is the point. This is what we're supposed to be doing in Lent. And if we don't go through the process of breaking that unholy communion, and if we don't go through the process of dying, we will not be resurrected in the new life. When I hear people speak of death as a punishment, I think that death is the most benevolent thing God could have ever done for us. It is the greatest gift besides Christ that God ever gave us, because we would be trapped forever. Imagine if we didn't die and we were stuck in this state and it kept getting worse and worse. Can you imagine if the Hitlers and the Stalins and these people, if their lives didn't come to an end, if they lived forever? Imagine the most evil among us living forever. I mean, this would be hell, you know? And so by giving us death, I think that is the most gracious thing he could have done with that circumstance, is to put a termination to it, because only death gives us an opportunity for a new life that is complete and full in God. Without death, we could not have it. Without death, there cannot be a resurrection. Without an end to this life, there cannot be a new life. And to be stuck in this one, as it is, would be the most horrible thing that could happen to us. So when I see people speak of death as a punishment in which God is causing retribution, getting even with us, I shake my head and I say, have you never met him? Have you never spent 5 minutes in his presence? Because if you did, I can't believe you would think this way. This isn't God getting even with us. This is God giving us the gift of an end to this and of a new possibility, a possible new life of peace and joy and grace in God that lasts forever. So I think that the questions that we started with are based upon a wrong paradigm that is not our paradigm. I don't think it's weakness merely that makes us sin. I think that once we have encountered sin and entered into a fallen world, which is where we live, I think it's weakness that makes us continue to sin. And as fallen creatures, weakness plays a major role in sin. But I don't believe it was man's weakness in the first place that caused the sin.
Was it curiosity?
I don't think we can answer that completely, but I think since what he was seeking was what? Knowledge. That I think wanting to know and the will of the self, I think those were the major factors.
So why
So
did
there's
God
the
show
knowledge of-
that?
Because there is something inherent in a self, in creating a free will being who is a self, an ego, a person, an existence, an independent existence, an individuated existence. There is something in that that has certain inherent qualities. Can a man love if he cannot choose?
No.
It's impossible. If you cannot choose, you cannot love. And if he was going to create a being that was like him, the first great act of humility from God was creating us because he knew we could reject him. And he made himself subject to our acceptance or rejection. That was the first big act of humility from God, right at the very beginning. Because he is love. He didn't need to create us. He desired to create us and chose to create us as beings that would exist in a perichoretic relationship with him. So perichoresis is
Sorry.
the interpenetration of persons into one another, such as what happens in marriage. It happens at various degrees as we encounter one another and get to know one another, and then may learn to really love one another and become close to one another. There's a moving inward of each person into the other. And this is what God is eternally. He exists in a perichoretic relationship eternally in the Trinity, completely interpenetrating one another. Well, he created us as beings that could share in that interpenetrating relationship. And it is my understanding that most Orthodox theologians understand that this is the difference between us and angels, that they don't have this capacity of interpenetration of persons. And so that's why what makes us distinctly in God's image, and this is the thing that angels look into, and it says want to understand, because they don't understand it, what this is and why God would do this with us.
Didn't do. And St. Paul was thrown in jail for like preaching.
Okay, so
And
the
drove up
question,
everything.
so the question is, why does God allow suffering to good people? That is a legitimate question. To ask, why did God let this person suffer, this one, and this way, and this way? There are 7 billion people on the planet,
Yes.
and they suffer probably several times a day. So that's 21 billion questions per day, every day. It's not reasonable that I'm going to answer that. But what I can answer is the larger question, why does he allow suffering generally? Okay, so what are some of the reasons we have seen, keeping in mind, let's presume that God is all benevolent and loving. Let's use that as our premise. What could be some reasons somebody who is all loving and benevolent allow people he loves to suffer? I think we can become too powerful. And what I mean by that is the idea when we don't suffer, that things, it was in the readings yesterday with Moses, where he said, remember what happened when I took you out of Egypt. Remember what happened. Was that today? Is it yesterday or today? I'm following the prophecy readings, which are amazing every day. But he's saying, your shoes didn't wear out. Your clothes didn't wear out, your feet didn't swell up. All this stuff didn't happen to you. Remember what I did for you out here in the wilderness. Remember this when I take you into that promised land and you conquer all these places, and know that it was me who did it. And he's saying, because you might start telling yourself, we're that awesome. And we did this. And he said, remember this. Because when you start thinking we did this, that's when it all comes apart. So yes, one primary thing that suffering does is it brings us back to our weakness. And in the place of complete weakness, that is the place where we seek God, isn't it? The last time you had the flu, have you ever prayed that much? When you were healthy? As you're hanging over a toilet bowl and you're praying. Do you ever pray more?
Stop. Finals, before finals.
Before finals. Do you pray like that when you're at Disneyland? No. No.
You're living your best life. You don't actually need God.
Exactly. So that is one thing. It brings us to our awareness of how much we need him. What's another way in which the suffering of a righteous man might be beneficial? Could it be beneficial to others?
To those. Sorry, I was thinking about it.
Are you familiar with the term martyr?
Yes.
What does that word mean? A martyr is a witness.
I knew that. I literally said that. It was right there.
I hate myself.
You
So-
said Sahid, and I'm like, that's what it is.
You said it in Arabic. You said the same word in Arabic.
Okay.
Understand.
A witness.
Sahid?
And
Oh,
what-
I knew that.
When we use this word witness, it means somebody who is testifying to what they have seen. This is what a witness does. So what is the testimony of a witness to Christ? Why we use this for those who have died, we use the word martyr, because that is the ultimate witness. But it actually applies in many ways. This is just the formal way in which we call certain people martyrs, but there are many ways to witness, to tell others what we have seen in God. But let's take this most extreme case of suffering and dying for Christ. What is the witness? What are we telling the rest of the world we have seen?
Christ.
But what? What else? What else are we telling them? His love. What else?
His mercy.
His mercy. Are we not telling them we have found another world? A greater world, a perfect world. And I'm more than happy to let go of this whole world, to have that one.
But then what happened to me?
This happened in the Roman Empire. It is remarkable when you read history. People were converted to Christianity after watching Christians being fed to lions. How does that make sense? Like, oh, I'm going to go into the arena for the big sporting event today, and I'm going to watch these people be killed by gladiators and wild beasts. Nero would take living Christians, and he would take a dead animal and empty out the carcass, empty out the insides, and he would sew them inside of there alive, and then turn wild dogs on them. He would use them, he would tie them to posts and cover them with oil down this pathway and light them on fire and use them as candles, alive, and ride his chariot down there and use them as human candles. Who would watch this and say, I want to be a Christian? How is that even possible? Somebody would watch this and say, I want to be a Christian. But it happens all the time. Because they saw something in those people. The way they responded to it. They saw Polycarp, who was tied to a stake. Actually, he said, no, you don't need to tie me. I'm not going anywhere. And they didn't tie him. And he stood there. And they saw the flames go around him and him becoming bronzed and not burning. So they had to run him through with a sword. They saw the Christians singing praises to God in perfect peace and joy as they're getting attacked by wild animals in the Colosseum. They're bearing witness, and these people are seeing this witness. And their suffering for a moment in time is bringing others into eternal peace with God. So this is another reason to allow suffering. When a martyr gives up his life, if today you were told to renounce Christ or die, and you said, no, I will die, you would be giving up your Lakers shirt. Honestly. You probably like your shirt. You bought it for a reason. You like it. You're not going to get it anymore. You bought those kind of pants because you like them. I don't know, some of you have a car. You're giving up your car. You're giving up your family. You're giving up your friends. You're giving up your favorite food. You're giving up everything that you encounter and have that you enjoy. You're letting go of all of that and your very life itself. All of it. Everything in this world is what you're giving up. Back in order to gain God. You're saying what?
You're like, I'll do it.
Okay, well, it's Lent.
I give up Snapchat. You're welcome. You're welcome.
Snapchat. Well, that's huge. And it
It's
is.
not for you, but like
It
it's
is.
hard for me to do it.
Okay, exactly.
I'm not.
So this is what Lent is. Back to the martyrdom. This is a small martyrdom. We're giving up food, some foods. We're giving up food for portions of the day. We're giving up social media entertainment. We're giving up many things that we would otherwise have voluntarily in order to gain another kingdom. This is what Lent is. This is what we're doing here. And so, again, when this happens, if we are not ashamed of the gospel and ashamed of Christ, and there is this transformation happening, others will see this in us. They will see something different about you than other people. And when they're having a time of crisis, you'll probably be the one they'll turn to for help because you bore witness of Christ. Even if you didn't mention his name, or they know she happens to be a Christian, but you bore witness of what that is. And now this person is in a time of suffering and they need something, and they noticed that when you were in a time of loss, that you had peace and joy. And they're going to say, how come that person had peace and joy in these very terrible circumstances? What's different? What do they have? What's going on with that person that he has that I don't have? And you'll be the one he turns to. And again, your suffering will be bearing a witness. And that witness will bear fruit in the lives of others, not just yourself, but also in yourself, as you will be seeking God and you will be returning to the humility that tells you, you don't have this world by the tail. You're not in control. You're not as powerful as you think you are. See, this is the thing I love about the elder Copts, because nobody has to tell them that they don't have power. They came from a land where they were reminded every day that they have no power by everybody around them. They were reminded, you don't have strength and you don't have power. You are weak. And they lived a life of trust in God because they knew they had no power. And it led them into Christ's arms where they lived. And when they do this, they mean it. With us, it's just a symbol. With them, they mean it, for the good and the bad. For what we receive and what we don't receive, we are grateful to you, God. This is what the elder Copts have. But here, we have power. You can vote. You can choose your school. If somebody treats you and discriminates against you, you can take them to court and sue them for a bunch of money. If somebody attacks you for your faith, you can sue them. You can have them thrown in jail. You have all kinds of recourse. You have so much power. It makes it very easy to forget that we need God. But the elder Copts from Egypt, they know they need God. That's why I don't pray in an American parish, because I have too much power as an American. I need to be surrounded by the ethnic Copts, the elder Copts. Today at liturgy, on a Friday liturgy at noon, is all the old Copts. That's where I need to be, because I have too much power. I need people around me who didn't have power, because I need what they have in their heart. I need what they experience, because they have an awareness. Well, Lent, in letting these things go, the first thing that happens is we find out what they mean to us, isn't it? like Snapchat or whatever. The rest of the time we might go like, yeah, whatever, it's not a big deal until it's time to let go. Then, us with television. Oh my gosh, we just started watching The Office, and the other night I'm like, well, how about we go on the computer and just look at GIFs of The Office, because, it's not realizing the place these things have in our lives until we go to let go of them. And then, in how hard it is to let go, this is what teaches us that we have no power. This is why sick people don't have to fast. Because when you're sick, you already know. You know you have no power. You know you need God. You know you're weak. You know you have no ability without him. You don't have to fast. But when you're healthy and well, you have power. And with that power is the illusion, the wrong illusion that you don't need God. And so we have to return every year to the high fast, to the in-depth awareness of how weak we are and how controlled and owned we are and how much we need God, and then turn and cling to him. This is what we're doing right now. So yes, why would God allow people to suffer? There is no other way to obtain so many things. Like we started at the beginning about the awareness of sin and what it does, and the benefit to us of going through suffering, the benefit to others around us. There are so many good reasons to allow us to suffer for a little while. That's what St. Paul says, right? That, like a parent lets his child suffer for a little while in order to attain something far greater. So, yes, this allowing us to suffer is benevolent. It is generous, and it is kind and loving of him. But there's a saying, the same sun that melts the wax hardens the clay. So it's how we choose to respond to suffering that will make the difference of whether we will come out of it hardened or softened, whether we will come out of it closer to God or harder and more shaking our fist at God. It's all in how we respond. There's a saying that the butterfly and the buzzard are both found in the desert, and one goes around searching for the hummingbird. And one goes around searching for life, and the other goes around searching for death, and they both find it. So it's really about what are we going to go searching for. And this is one of my pet peeves when I hear people complaining about the church and people in the church. It's like, really? Because I've been to a lot of parishes. I've spoken in 3 countries, on 2 continents. We've spoken all over the East Coast. We speak everywhere all the time. I have never been to one parish where you couldn't go in early on a Sunday. Usually go in at 8 o'clock on a Sunday. You guys wouldn't believe it. Church starts at 8. I know, right? But you go in at 8 o'clock and see some of those people that are there, and usually you can point to them and say, that's what it's supposed to look like. But I hear people complaining about the church and the people, and it's like, yeah, because you're the buzzard. You walk in and you look for the death. You look for the ugly things and you see them. And they are there. There are ugly people in every parish, but that's what you're seeing. When there's life in front of you, you're looking at the death. When there are examples of what it's supposed to look like, you're looking at the hypocrites. That's why you're so bitter with the church. But if you just gain the eyes to see the life in front of you, in every parish there are people that I could just sit under their feet and learn from them for years on what it means to become a Christian. So who are we looking at? But it's all in what we're looking for and how we're going to respond to it that's going to make the difference in what that suffering will do for us.
How can,
So is your question about it's called the hypostatic union? So there's the term hypostatic union. Hypostasis is a person. So it's the union of God with humanity in a person, who is Christ. That's the hypostatic union. I'm going to start at the end, and then I'll move backwards. Okay, I'll start at the end and move backwards. Ultimately, we cannot understand. Because again, this is beyond our experience. Do you remember I said what's beyond our experience has to be spoken of in analogy? So we can have certain pictures and statements about it that we know are true, but to say how can we fully grasp it, we can't. You won't. You won't fully grasp a number of things. And that's not surprising because our God is what's called transcendent. So he exists above and beyond the reality that we know in a state of being that we cannot know. And so it shouldn't be surprising that he does things that we will never be able to understand.
And that's one of the evidences of God being a true God, because you look at other religions and their gods are very understandable. You can wrap your head around them.
The hypostatic union, there is no definitive way to fully express, but there are expressions we can use. So, for instance, in his, and this is where you got to be real careful. Okay, in all of theology, this idea of Christ becoming man is the minefield of theology. You try walking and you take one step this way, kaboom, you're blown up. One step that way, boom. It's like a minefield. You have to be careful with every little word you say when you talk about this, or you're a heretic. It's really that bad, this whole subject of Christology. But you can navigate it. So when you say God became finite, okay, God joined himself to humanity, and in his humanity, he is finite, and all things which are human. Everything which you can say about a human, he is in his humanity. Yet all things we can say about God, he is in his divinity. It is a person. But now, here's where we had a problem with Chalcedon, because when they say in his nature, well, natures don't do things. That's why St. Cyril said we can speak in theory of two natures, but when we speak of a concrete action, we can't speak of two, we can only speak of one. Because when we say...
his divinity called Lazarus out of the tomb, and his humanity got thirsty and hungry.
Okay, divinity doesn't do so. A nature doesn't do something.
Yeah.
A person does
A nature
something.
doesn't call somebody out of the tomb. A person does. A nature doesn't get thirsty. A person does.
A person. So all of these, so you can say the person, who is Christ, raised Lazarus from the dead according to his divinity, or in his divinity. The person, Christ, got hungry or thirsty according to his humanity. But his humanity didn't get hungry. Humanity doesn't do things. Persons do. The person became hungry in his humanity according to his humanity. You see? Okay, so you can say, the best way I've found is to say according to his humanity this, according to his divinity that. But I don't like the Chalcedon language either of saying this nature, because natures don't do things. Persons do things. So I think we were right all along.